Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'm Matt Brill from Latham & Watkins in Washington, D.C. I chair our communications practice, and I'm pleased to appear on behalf of NECTA, the New England Cable and Telecommunications Association. I'd like to talk about the interplay between federal law and state law on these issues, but I just want to start by reaffirming that the companies I represent, cable broadband providers, are firmly committed to principles of net neutrality. Everybody agrees that consumers should have the right to access the content they want, use the devices they want without being blocked or throttled. There's really no dispute about that. The disputes that have occurred in front of the FCC are all about the legal authority at the federal level that's used to enshrine these principles. And there has been a debate raging for years in Washington about what's known as Title I or Title II. These are arcane legal concepts that ultimately have nothing to do with net neutrality. They're about the statutory framework, and the reason that ISPs have been concerned about Title II regulation is it authorizes rate regulation and a whole bunch of heavy-handed 1930s common carrier regulations that ultimately have nothing to do with net neutrality. So ISPs have not lobbied against net neutrality. To the contrary, they've publicly pledged to support net neutrality. Their business practices are built on the open internet, and nothing is going to change in that regard. In fact, the ISPs that I've worked with all support federal legislation to enshrine core principles of transparency, no blocking, no throttling, and no unfair discrimination. And the question really is how best to effectuate these principles. Federal legislation is the answer here. This is an interstate service that cannot be effectively regulated by 50 different states. All of the bills that the gentleman before me represented address this problem in slightly different ways. They would impose different legal standards, and this interstate service cannot be effectively regulated at the state level, either as a matter of policy or as a matter of law. In the meantime, while Congress debates an appropriate regime to enshrine and protect net neutrality, the Federal Trade Commission does have power to hold providers to their promises. All of NECTA's members throughout the region and all major ISPs nationwide have all pledged to maintain net neutrality, and those are binding commitments to consumers that the FTC can enforce and that state attorney generals can enforce to the extent they're acting consistently with federal law. The problem with the bills in front of this committee is that they are preempted by federal law. The FCC's Restoring Internet Freedom order explicitly preempts state action that enshrines net neutrality at the state level because it's an interstate service and because a patchwork of different regulations is going to impede rather than advance the important role of broadband deployment and competition. The Supreme Court has upheld preemption in the specific context of state procurement laws, and the reason is that although states have every right to specify the conditions of service that are provided to the state itself, it can't be a backdoor means of regulating the service provided to the public at large, and that's what these bills would do. These bills would simply impose the same types of net neutrality obligations that are being debated at the federal level through state legislation. When the state acts as a market participant, again, it can specify the level of service to itself, or rather can certainly specify in contracts with ISPs that blocking isn't permitted and throttling isn't permitted in pay per addition, but it cannot dictate the terms on which consumers are going to buy internet service. That can only be done at the federal level. The right answer here is federal legislation. It's something that consumers will support. It's something that ISPs will support. And I hope this committee will also support federal legislation.
So in short, just to be clear, you're saying you support federal legislation, not federal rulemaking. You're not calling on the FCC to do something in regards to this. You're calling on Congress to do that.
Our NECTA members and cable broadband providers and other ISPs did support FCC rules. The FCC took action that maintained the transparency rule, eliminated other rules. Those rules are now going to court. So we're not going to have further rulemaking activities for the time being at the FCC. We're going to have a federal court proceeding that will decide the validity of that. But Congress doesn't need to defer to the FCC. It goes the other way around.
Right. It seems like your message to us, just to be clear on it, is that Congress should take this up. When you say the federal government, you're not referring to the FCC. So Congress should make the
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the problem we've had is the absence of a clear statutory mandate, and that's what we need.
And then you said that the bills before us are preempted by federal law. I'd like to be really clear on that. Are you saying federal law or some regulation that the FCC is promulgating? Is there really a federal law that you can cite, that we can look at?
Yes.
Or-
So it is the FCC's Restoring Internet Freedom Order, paragraph 194. That order specifically states that if a state attempts to impose...
Wait. My question was, you said that you believe these bills are preempted by federal law. Now you say the FCC's order. So is there a federal statute on the books that you're referring to that you believe preempts these bills, or is it an FCC order?
Mr. Chairman, it's the FCC order, which of course is federal law.
Well, I'm just asking to be specific about it, because there is a difference.
Yes. And although I would like to point out that the U.S. Supreme Court has said on about a dozen occasions that federal agency regulations have precisely the same preemptive effect as federal statutes. A case called Capital Cities Cable versus FCC, in fact, involved an early FCC regulation of broadcast advertisements for gambling. And in that case, the same kind of argument was made that Congress needs to specifically authorize preemption. The Supreme Court has disagreed with that for decades and held that agency regulations preempt state law to the precise same degree as statutes.
Thank you. Any questions on this bill?
Thank you. Mr. Brill, so with the exception of the Tax Reform Act that was passed 6-8 weeks ago, is there a single piece of substantive legislation that you can point to that the federal government has pursued in the last 8 years that would give us any hope to think that they're capable of passing something at the federal level to deal with this issue right now?
There have been several net neutrality bills introduced, both on the Senate side and on the House side. And there bipartisan legislation from Senator Thune and Senator Nelson on the Senate side has been a leading vehicle, and Chairman Walden of the House Commerce Committee has introduced legislation, Congressman Blackburn, and then several bills that are being actively debated at this time.
Any other questions?